My landlady caught me behind on rent, and I jokingly asked if I could pay in another way. What happened next changed everything. The day had been unusually quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in your apartment and makes every little sound stand out, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant chatter from the street below, even the faint creak of the old wooden floorboards. I was just settling into my small, cluttered living room when a familiar knock on the door jolted me from my thoughts. It was her. The landlady. The very mention of her name used to make my stomach twist in that peculiar mix of anxiety and anticipation. She had a way of appearing exactly when I least expected it, her presence filling the narrow hallway with an almost imperceptible warmth. Her heels clicked lightly against the tiles as she stepped inside, a faint scent of lavender trailing behind her, and I couldn't help but notice the way the sunlight caught the subtle silver in her hair, the confident tilt of her chin, the faint smile that never quite left her lips. "You're behind on rent again," she said, voice calm but precise, carrying that unmistakable authority that I had come to both dread and admire. Her eyes, a soft brown with flecks of gold, scanned me as though she were trying to weigh my sincerity against the words I might offer. I swallowed, my palms slightly clammy, fingers brushing against the edge of the doorframe for grounding. I forced a smile, trying to match her composed posture, even though inside I was spiraling with embarrassment. I could pay in another way," I said, letting a hint of nervous humor lace my words. Her eyebrows arched slightly, and for a moment, the tension in the room shifted, not in accusation but in curiosity. There was something about the way she leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed yet relaxed, that made it impossible to look away. The air between us felt charged, every small movement, the tilt of her head, the brushing of a loose strand of hair behind her ear, amplifying the quiet rhythm of our interaction. I realized, almost embarrassingly, that I was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her as she moved closer to retrieve a folder she had brought. Even the faint rustle of her clothes as she shifted seemed louder, more intimate, in that stillness. My mind raced with a mix of dread and anticipation. Was she just here to scold me, or was there something else hidden behind that carefully measured calm? In that first encounter, before any words could truly land, a subtle spark had already ignited. A connection neither of us had yet named, a tension neither wanted to release too soon. And as I stood there, trying to maintain composure, I couldn't help but wonder, what would happen if I let the tension linger just a little longer? After the initial tension of the rent reminder, an odd sort of quiet settled between us. I shifted uncomfortably on my feet, aware of her presence in a way I hadn't anticipated. The hallway felt smaller, more intimate, the ordinary clutter of my apartment fading into the background. Every detail of her seemed amplified, the soft way her shoes scuffed against the floor, the subtle tilt of her head as she watched me, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. "I could pay in another way," I repeated, forcing a casualness I didn't feel. My words were meant as a joke, but the nervous edge in my voice made them sound bolder than intended. Her lips curved slightly, just enough to hint at amusement, but she didn't laugh. That small reaction, barely perceptible, sent a jolt through me. She leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms, but not defensively. Instead, it was as if she were evaluating me, reading more between my words than I had spoken. The air between us was suddenly charged with something unspoken, something electric yet subtle. I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her, a gentle pressure in the space between us that made me acutely aware of every movement I made. Her gaze lingered longer than necessary, those deep brown eyes studying me with quiet curiosity. I couldn't look away, caught in the pull of her steady presence. My own hands twitched slightly at my sides, unsure where to place them, and I realized I was holding my breath. I started, then paused, unsure how much of my nervous charm she would read as sincerity. She tilted her head slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture that both disarmed and intrigued me. For a fleeting moment, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of us, the hallway, the sunlight filtering through the blinds, the quiet hum of the city outside, all fading into a backdrop for this unexpected connection. Even in her calm, composed demeanor, there was a subtle softness, a quiet vulnerability that drew me in. It wasn't just the playful tension in our words, it was the unspoken recognition of something deeper, something neither of us fully understood yet. The way she shifted her weight, the brief brush of her hand against the folder she held, even the faint scent of her perfume, it all combined to make my pulse race, a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. For a moment, I imagined what it might feel like to step a little closer, to see if the tension could turn into something tangible, something real. But I hesitated, knowing that the slow burn, the gradual unfolding of connection, was far more intoxicating than rushing toward certainty. And as we stood there, exchanging subtle glances and half-smiles, I realized that this moment, charged, quiet, and delicately poised, was only the beginning. The initial tension of rent and playful banter had settled into a softer rhythm, like the quiet after a storm. We moved beyond the superficial words, drifting into a conversation that felt unexpectedly personal. I found myself sharing more than I usually would with anyone, not just the bare facts of my life, but the little frustrations and small triumphs that usually stayed tucked away. "You know," I said, hesitating for a moment as I brushed my hair back from my face, "it's harder than it looks, keeping everything together on my own sometimes." My voice carried a hint of vulnerability, an honesty I hadn't intended to reveal so soon. Her expression softened. There was a warmth in her gaze, a steady patience that made it easier to speak. "I understand," she replied, her tone calm but not indifferent. "Life has a way of piling on more than you expect. Sometimes, you just need a little space to breathe." It was the way she said it, measured, thoughtful, with just enough softness to make me notice the tiny inflections in her voice. I realized then that she had a depth to her, shaped by experience, that drew people in without effort. She had lived through challenges I could only guess at, and yet there was no heaviness in her presence, only an understated grace. I glanced at her as she shifted slightly to reach for the folder on the counter. The sunlight fell across her face, highlighting the fine lines at the corner of her eyes, the curve of her smile, and something in me stirred. It wasn't desire in the conventional sense, at least, not yet, but a deep recognition of the comfort and intrigue she radiated. Her fingers brushed mine for just a moment as she handed me the folder. The contact was fleeting, but enough to make my heart rate quicken, to send a warm pulse of awareness through me. I caught myself studying the subtle gestures, the tilt of her shoulders, the small sigh as she leaned back against the counter, the way her eyes seemed to search mine, not for answers, but for understanding. "I don't know how you do it," I admitted quietly. "Keeping it all together, day after day. You make it seem effortless." She smiled, a small, almost shy lift of the lips that seemed out of character for someone so confident. "It's not effortless," she said softly, "but it's easier when you focus on the little victories. And sometimes, it helps to have someone who listens." I felt a strange comfort in that moment, a quiet connection forming between us. The air was heavy with unspoken curiosity, the kind that builds slowly, like sunlight warming a room. We weren't rushing anything, there was no urgency, only the gentle pull of two people noticing each other in a way that was both tender and quietly thrilling. And in that ordinary apartment, amidst folders and sunlight, I realized that something unexpected was beginning, something that had the power to change the rhythm of my life, if I dared to follow it. The conversation had shifted seamlessly into comfortable silence, a space that felt surprisingly intimate. We were no longer speaking just to fill the air, every word and movement carried weight. I could feel it in the way her presence seemed to expand, filling the narrow hallway and even my own chest with a quiet intensity one couldn't ignore. I found myself moving closer, ostensibly to grab a pen she had dropped, but as I bent down, our shoulders brushed. A jolt of warmth surged through me, soft, electric, and entirely distracting. She didn't pull away, instead, her hand lingered near mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary. I caught my breath, aware of the closeness, aware of how ordinary touches could suddenly feel charged with meaning. Her gaze met mine. It was steady, calm, yet layered with something unspoken. There was a pause, a suspended moment where words seemed unnecessary. I noticed the slight catch in her breath, the faint shift of her weight, the almost imperceptible softening of her expression. Every detail etched itself into my mind, each one amplifying the tension that had been quietly building since our first encounter. I was hyper-aware of the subtle cues, the warmth radiating from her, the gentle scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the faint brush of her hair against her cheek as she turned her head slightly. The hallway, with its peeling wallpaper and sun-streaked floorboards, became a stage for a silent dialogue neither of us dared to voice. When she reached for the folder again, our fingers brushed. A simple, practical gesture, yet it sent a rush of heat through me. Her eyes flickered down at our hands and then back to mine, a small, almost teasing smile tugging at her lips. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt too loud for the quiet intensity of the moment. The unspoken tension between us was palpable. It wasn't just curiosity or attraction, it was a mutual recognition of something delicate, fragile, yet undeniable. My heart thumped in my chest as I realized how acutely I was noticing every nuance of her movement, every slight change in her expression. She, in turn, seemed just as aware, her posture relaxed yet charged, every glance and gesture a careful balance between restraint and invitation. For a brief moment, time felt suspended. The world outside, the city noise, the distant hum of traffic, disappeared, leaving only the rhythm of our shared space, the quiet brush of hands, the heat of proximity, and the unspoken question lingering in the air: what would happen if we let the tension unfold, even slightly? And in that quiet, charged moment, I understood that the slow burn between us wasn't just teasing curiosity anymore, it was growing into something far more tangible, far more irresistible, and entirely real. The air between us had grown heavier in a way that neither words nor silence could fully describe. The lingering glances, the brushed shoulders, and the subtle touches had built a quiet bridge, carrying us from polite curiosity to something far more intimate. That evening, when the sunlight slanted across the living room just right, it felt like the perfect backdrop for honesty. I didn't mean to get behind on rent, I admitted softly, my voice lower than usual. My hands twisted in my lap as I avoided her gaze for a fraction of a second, but I could feel her attention on me, unwavering, patient. Things have been tight lately. More than I thought I could handle. Her eyes softened, those deep brown pools reflecting understanding rather than judgment. She moved closer, settling into the chair opposite mine, and for a moment, her presence was almost overwhelming, not in size or force, but in quiet, undeniable gravity. I know, she said gently. Life throws more at us than we sometimes realize. And yet here you are, trying to manage it all, even if imperfectly. I dared to glance at her, noticing the subtle vulnerability beneath her confident exterior, the slight crease at the corner of her eyes, the faint sigh as she leaned back, the relaxed curve of her shoulders that made her seem both approachable and impossibly poised. There was an honesty in her gaze, a wordless invitation to speak freely, to show the parts of myself I usually kept hidden. I guess I've been trying not to ask for help, I confessed, my voice almost a whisper. But sometimes it feels like I'm failing, and I don't know how to fix it. Her hand reached out, almost tentatively, brushing a loose strand of hair from my forehead. The contact was brief, feather-light, yet it sent a pulse of warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. I noticed the way her fingers lingered for a heartbeat, and the steadying effect of her touch calmed the nervous flutter in my chest. You're not failing, she said quietly, her voice a soothing anchor. We all have moments like this. It doesn't define you. In that moment, the room seemed smaller, warmer, more intimate. The world outside faded, leaving only us and the unspoken recognition of trust building between two people. Her hand withdrew, but the lingering warmth remained, like an imprint of reassurance on my skin. For the first time, I realized that this connection, the slow, deliberate pull between us, wasn't just playful tension anymore. It was something more profound, a shared vulnerability, a mutual acknowledgement of the struggles and desires that often remain hidden. And in that quiet, charged space, I felt the beginnings of something I hadn't anticipated, a tenderness that promised deeper intimacy if we were willing to explore it together. The air in the apartment felt warmer than usual, not from the sun filtering through the blinds, but from the subtle closeness that had grown between us. The earlier confessions had shifted something unspoken, our interactions carried a new weight, a delicate intimacy that neither of us wanted to rush, yet both of us noticed. I was helping her organize some papers and minor household clutter she had brought over from her office. As I handed her a stack, our fingers brushed. Just a simple contact, but it lingered in my mind, and I could sense it lingered with her too. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, and I felt my chest tighten in that familiar mix of warmth and nervous excitement. She shifted to hand me another folder, and our shoulders touched briefly. The sensation was quiet, almost accidental, yet it carried a current of awareness, an acknowledgement of closeness without words. I caught her glance, the one that seemed to say she knew the effect our proximity had on each other but was content to let it linger. The subtle tension between us was no longer just playful curiosity, it had evolved into something charged, deliberate, yet entirely gentle. At one point, we both reached for a pen at the same time, and our hands rested together for a heartbeat longer than necessary. I could feel the warmth of her skin, the faint pulse beneath her wrist. She withdrew slightly, but not fully, leaving a small space between us that felt intimate rather than distant. I realized then that even the briefest gestures, the brush of a hand, a shared laugh, the accidental touch of shoulders, were powerful enough to speak volumes. We ended up sitting side by side on the couch, sorting through paperwork. I became acutely aware of the subtle rhythm of her movements, the way her hair brushed against her cheek and occasionally against mine as she leaned forward. I noticed the faint scent of her perfume, the comforting weight of her presence so close, and the softness in her eyes when she looked at me. There was no need for grand gestures or declarations. This was a moment built on small, deliberate closeness, a shared warmth, a gentle touch, and the unspoken acknowledgement of mutual curiosity and desire. I reached over to adjust a paper near her hand, letting my fingers brush hers. She didn't pull away, only allowed the contact, a quiet reassurance of connection. In that space, I realized that intimacy didn't always have to be loud or dramatic. It could be found in lingering touches, shared laughter, and moments of simple presence. The slow burn between us had grown deeper, more tangible, yet still beautifully restrained, a promise of something more if we were willing to explore it together. And in that quiet, unassuming closeness, I felt a surge of anticipation for what might come next. The quiet tension that had filled the apartment all week seemed to settle into something gentler, warmer, almost like the soft afterglow of a storm. The rent had been partially forgiven, or perhaps more accurately, set aside in a way that neither of us had to speak too much about, a silent acknowledgement of trust and understanding. It felt less like a transaction and more like an unspoken agreement that we were both willing to meet each other halfway, in practical matters and, perhaps, emotionally. We were seated side by side, the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds, casting long, golden stripes across the floor. She shifted slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and I noticed how the light caught the faint silver streaks in her hair, softening the edges of her confidence into something more human, approachable. My fingers twitched, and almost instinctively, I reached out, letting my hand hover near hers. She didn't move away, instead, her hand shifted subtly, letting our fingers brush. The contact was brief but meaningful, warm and grounding, as if the simple touch could convey everything we hadn't yet dared to say. We spoke softly then, not about rent or responsibilities, but about the small, human things, favorite memories, hopes for the week ahead, the way the city looked from the apartment window. Our conversation was easy, flowing naturally, punctuated by quiet laughter that filled the corners of the room. Yet beneath the light-hearted words was an unspoken acknowledgement. This connection, fragile yet undeniable, had grown into something neither of us wanted to let go. I noticed the subtle movements, the way her shoulder brushed mine when she reached for a book, the slight pause when our eyes met, the comforting warmth in her smile. Every small gesture spoke of trust, curiosity, and an emerging intimacy that went far beyond casual acquaintance. In that moment, the apartment felt like a cocoon of warmth, safety, and possibility. Finally, as she stood to leave, I gently took her hand in mine, letting my thumb brush across her knuckles. She looked down at our hands, and then back up at me, her eyes soft and inviting. I could feel the shared understanding between us. This slow-burn connection had moved beyond flirtation and playful tension. It was real, anchored in mutual respect, vulnerability, and subtle, meaningful affection. As she left, closing the door behind her, I lingered by the threshold, smiling to myself. The tension hadn't vanished, it had transformed into something far more promising. The story wasn't about dramatic confessions or rushed passion, it was about a quiet, steady discovery of each other, the delicate unfolding of trust, and the warm assurance that sometimes, connection grows strongest in the spaces between words and gestures. And in that delicate, patient way, we had both found something worth holding on to. Did you feel the slow burn between them too? If you loved this story, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next age gap romance. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in his shoes?